everyone. When you think of an inn or a tavern, what kind of image comes to mind? Perhaps a place to rest your tired body, where you can momentarily escape from everyday life and find a bit of peace. But in medieval England, inns were not merely places to sleep. Most inns of the time also functioned as taverns, bustling with people, a far cry from a peaceful retreat. You might wonder, who would use such a place? Yet, these combined tavern inns played a significant role in society back then. Supported by many people, these locations served as spaces for religious and economic development. Today, let's embark on a journey through history to explore how inns and taverns developed in medieval England, and what they meant to the people of that era. First, let's introduce a drink that was essential to inns and taverns in medieval England. This drink is called ale, an alcoholic beverage. Beer lovers might recognize it, as ale remains popular today as a type of beer. Ale was widely consumed in England even before the medieval era. But back then, it wasn't regarded so much as an alcoholic treat, but rather as an everyday drink. People's staple food was bread made from grains, and ale was made from the same ingredients, grains and yeast. In that sense, ale could be considered liquid bread, and was a regular part of people's diets, providing essential nutrients. Additionally, in a time when there was no proper water supply system, it was not easy to obtain safe drinking water. It is said that drinking ale, which had undergone a form of sterilization through fermentation, was likely safer than drinking water. Ale was indispensable to the lives of medieval English people. Surprisingly, it wasn't the professional brewers who made ale. It was actually ordinary women in households. They would bake bread and brew ale as part of their daily routine. Each household's ale probably had its own unique taste. With an alcohol content of around 2%, even children could drink it. Ale was meant to be consumed fresh, and without bottling technology. The carbonation would have easily gone away. It seems this was a very different beverage from modern beer, perhaps better described as a nutritious, fermented drink. Monasteries also took part in brewing ale. Monasteries and alcohol may seem an unlikely combination, but at that time, most monasteries had their own breweries and unique recipes. Monasteries even contributed to the technological development of ale production. It is said that monks consumed more than 5 liters of ale daily, sometimes even up to 10 liters. In the early 13th century, monasteries began offering inns where people could enjoy ale. Monasteries were, of course, religious centers where people gathered for spiritual guidance. But they were also social hubs where visitors could exchange information. Among these visitors were wealthy or influential individuals, who funded the monasteries or donated land. Naturally, the monasteries wanted to welcome and please these benefactors. For monasteries in medieval times, hospitality was very important. They began creating comfortable accommodations within the monastery, offering rooms where visitors could rest and enjoy meals along with their prized ale. Initially, this lodging system was free and depended on donations. But eventually, they realized, we could actually charge for this. Thus, they started building designated lodgings exclusively for visitors. Soon, monasteries across the land aimed to provide top-tier hospitality, focusing on menu variety, comfort, and first-class service, much like modern hotels. The better their reputation as inns, the more profit the monastery could make, so it was essential. This sparked a trend where monasteries competed to offer the finest hospitality. As a result, monastery inns in major cities like London, where they were conveniently located, thrived. Meanwhile, monasteries in less popular or less prosperous areas often found themselves in debt, running at a loss. Wealthy visitors were warmly welcomed, while poor travelers were sometimes turned away. Thus, as monasteries became innkeepers, their treatment of guests varied based on social standing. If the guest was an important figure, the abbot would dine with them as a gesture of hospitality. This was likely a welcome occasion for the abbot, since the usual monastery fare consisted of simple, self-sustained bread and vegetables. But when dining with guests, they could enjoy more luxurious foods like meat. The monastery became not just a religious site but also a social space. An inn and a tavern where people from various walks of life gathered. Meanwhile, ale taverns also developed outside the monasteries. Among the women who brewed ale at home, some became known as alewives, renowned for the quality of their ale. Starting around the late 14th century, these women began serving their prized ale to customers beyond their families, establishing ale houses, homely taverns. Originally, women brewed ale for their families, often sharing surplus with villagers or serving it at home. Ale couldn't be stored long back then, it quickly soured and became undrinkable. So, it made sense to serve it generously while it was still fresh and delicious. Eventually, some of these women thought to sell their ale, even setting up tavern spaces in their homes for guests. Just as monastery lodging became fee-based, ale brewed at home gradually found its place for sale in alehouses, marking a shift towards ale as a commercial tavern staple. By the 14th century, thousands of travelers were visiting annually. However, distances between villages were vast, and with more heavily traveled roads, outdoor sleeping became increasingly dangerous. This led to a rising demand for safe lodging, and thus taverns, inns, or establishments combining both began to appear across medieval England. Now, let's step inside one of these inns of the time. Starting with the meals, most inns had a kitchen, offering warm food to guests. Common menu items included bread and cheese, pottage soup, and salted fish, simple fare. Some inns, however, served roasted meats or pies with bacon. Most guests ate these meals with their hands, and, naturally, drank plenty of ale. Next, let's take a look at the rooms. Straw beds were set up in shared spaces, where multiple guests would sleep together. Most inns also had a stable for the horses guests rode in on. It was similar to a parking lot today. and inns often sold hay for feeding the horses, essentially doubling as a gas station. Ale wasn't the only drink served in taverns. Some establishments offered wine. Unlike ale, however, wine had to be imported from France daily, making it more expensive. This meant that taverns serving wine generally attracted wealthier clientele. In large towns like London, taverns ranged from affordable to luxurious, competing for business. In smaller towns, inns and taverns served as gathering places, essential for driving local economy and politics. Yet, these places weren't necessarily comfortable. This was the Middle Ages, a time without electricity, or even widespread use of lamps. At night, inns and taverns were lit only by candles, creating dimly lit spaces where faces were often hard to see. Even in winter, fireplaces were rare, so interiors remained cold and dark. The smell of horses from the stable likely filled the air, along with the sour scent of ale that had fermented too long and been spilled by guests. It seems that crime and brawls were also common during this period. Inns attracted many people, so it's easy to imagine arguments escalating or people getting drunk on strong liquor and causing trouble. There were incidents like jewelry or cash being stolen from inn safes, and even cases where a clergyman's son was attacked and killed with an axe. Inns and taverns often became scenes of violence and crime. As these incidents became a growing concern, new laws and regulations were introduced. In 1343, a law was enacted requiring tavern owners to make customers leave their weapons at the tavern when they went outside. Within London's city walls, citizens were not allowed to walk around armed. However, visitors from outside London often carried weapons, so tavern owners were obligated to warn patrons against carrying them. Furthermore, an edict was issued, declaring that all inns and their owners should be of good character. One can almost imagine people grumbling, inns have become such strict, boring places these days. There was a time when royalty used local inns. King Edward II, for instance, commanded the town's inns to host his guests and their attendants for 4 days, free of charge during his coronation. For the townsfolk who spent their time relaxing in inns and taverns with homemade ale, having noble officials intrude on their social spaces may not have been entirely welcome. In this way, the inns and taverns of medieval times, once central to socializing and relaxation, gradually evolved with history. By the 16th century, the dissolution of monasteries during the Reformation left a gap, and the number of taverns grew to fill it. Additionally, ale production shifted from homes to large-scale breweries, which further increased the number of taverns. Today, in modern England, the tavern has transformed into what is fondly known as the pub. The word pub comes from public house, essentially meaning a public gathering space. The name reflects the history of monasteries and inns as places where people would gather and socialize. While we can't visit a medieval tavern today, it would be wonderful to experience a pub and taste ale on a trip to England. Anyway, shall we order a beer at the izakaya tonight? The history of the world still holds many mysteries. Let's continue our journey to uncover them together. See you on the next trip. Thank you for watching.